recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection,
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of House Joint Resolution 24, disapproving the action of the District of Columbia in enacting the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022, introduced by the chairman of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability, James Comer of Kentucky. Our nation's capital city is in crisis. Crime is rampant. Students in D.C. public schools suffered historic learning loss because Democrats kept schools closed. Buildings are sitting empty while federal workers continue to work from home. But the D.C. Council has prioritized a bill to allow non-citizens, including illegal immigrants and foreign employees at embassies, openly hostile to the United States, to vote in local elections. This move by the D.C. Council dilutes the votes of American citizens, including the many residents of the district who struggled and sacrificed to obtain legal citizenship the right way. Voting is a pillar of American democracy and a constitutional right that must be protected and preserved for citizens of our country. Voting is how Americans exert their will upon their government. Voting ultimately determines how laws are written and enforced so that citizens can shape the rules under which they can earn a living and be protected from harm. Voting is an essential privilege and responsibility established at great cost throughout our nation's history. To quote one of our founding fathers, Samuel Adams, let each citizen remember at the moment he is offering his vote that he is executing one of the most solemn trusts in human society. On November 21st, 2022, the D.C. Council chose to trash this solemn trust by granting this sacred right of voting to anyone residing in the district, including those here illegally and other non-citizens. Now just think about the immediate implications of this law. Our nation's capital city plays host to virtually hundreds of foreign organizations and embassies. Many of those foreign nationals have interests directly opposed to those of the United States, and they make no claim otherwise. D.C.'s law makes 0 exceptions for such individuals whose role may be to disrupt or destroy the American way of life in the principles that our nation stands upon. For years, Democrats in Washington decried potential foreign influence in our electoral process. But D.C.'s new law potentially allows foreign agents from China, Russia, and other adversaries to participate in local elections held within this nation's capital city. It's no secret that President Biden's policies have created the worst border crisis in American history, bar none. Just this week, the Committee on Oversight and Accountability heard from the U.S. Border Patrol about how the Biden administration's policies are undermining their ability to secure our southern border. Now, D.C. Democrats are providing another magnet for illegal immigration. This law is so bad that the D.C. Council even lost the support of the Washington Post's editorial board. In October of last year, the Washington Post editorial board announced it opposed the bill, declaring, voting is a foundational right of citizenship. The Post went on to note that allowing an estimated 50,000 non-citizen D.C. residents to vote is just simply a bridge too far. And I think most of us can agree on that. And I think most of the American people would certainly agree with that. Even D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser agrees with us. And she chose to withhold her own signature from this legislation. While the bill was ultimately enacted without her support, it is shocking that even the progressive Democrat mayor of D.C. does not support the actions of this out-of-control D.C. Council. If a bill goes too far for Mayor Bowser, then the alarm bell should be ringing in every state and locality across the nation. Our free and fair elections are the hallmark of a healthy democracy, and we must protect them. The D.C. Council's law intends to do the opposite. For these reasons, I urge you to support my resolution of disapproval to stop this radical reform in its tracks, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to House Joint Resolution 24, which seeks to nullify the duly enacted laws of the District of Columbia and violates the principle of local democratic self-government, which is at the heart of the Home Rule Charter for Washington, D.C., and also violates the equal protection and democratic principles that animate our Constitution. Now, I'd like to begin just by observing a striking juxtaposition and contrast between the address we heard last night, the State of the Union address from the President, and the lecture that we just received now from the floor leader. President Biden appeared here with a message of unity under the powerful economic growth that we're experiencing as a country. 12 million new jobs added, record progress that we're making on climate change, massive investment in the American people in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the Infrastructure Act, a $1.2 trillion investment in the roads and the highways and the bridges and the ports and the airports. And we're dramatically reducing health care costs for people in the Medicare program, reducing to $35 a month what diabetics have to pay for their insulin shots. We're making progress for America. So, what do our good friends across the aisle come back with today, the day after this great statement of national purpose and progress? They want us to become the super council for the District of Columbia and begin to micromanage the bills that are being passed by the representatives locally of 713,000 people. With no national agenda, with no plans for getting on board with American progress, what do they have? Well, they're going to bring us a whole series of these disapproval resolutions for the people of Washington, D.C. They don't want to vote in Washington, D.C. They don't want to live in D.C. They can move to D.C. and run for D.C. Council if that's their interest. But no, they just want to lord it over the people of Washington. So they don't like the District of Columbia's voting rules, and they don't like the criminal justice reform they just engaged in for a period of a decade with judges and lawyers and the D.C. bar and the people participating. They don't have a hearing on any of it. They just want to decree that they're going to strike it down. And just you wait. They'll be coming back with our gun safety laws that will appear in Congress from the people in D.C. because there's that part of the Home Rule Charter that gives us this opportunity if we want to micromanage their policy. So we'll see gun safety laws, we'll see abortion legislation, we'll see equal rights for the LGBTQ population. All of these things the Republican minority used to do a long time ago, but they've brought back the worst possible instincts. They don't want to have a hearing on it. We didn't have a single hearing in the Oversight Committee about any of this legislation, none of it. Did they go to the D.C. Council when it was debated? No, they didn't do that. Did they invite the mayor of the D.C. Council to come here? No, they didn't do that. They just decided they're going to slap around the local population. None of us would accept it for the localities that we represent. Now, it so happens that people in Washington, D.C. are not just a locality, a municipality. The people in Washington are involved right now in a petition for statehood admission to the Union. In fact, in the 116th Congress, in the 117th Congress, this body voted to approve their petition for statehood, but our friends across the aisle opposed that. If it passed the House, if the Senate had approved it, well then the people of D.C. or whatever their local system is would be just able to decide these things on their own, just like the people in New York City or Albany or any other town in New York would be able to decide for themselves. I thought that our friends over there were interested in local self-government. I thought they supported home rule, but apparently not when it comes to the people of Washington, D.C. So we reject this throwback attempt at micromanaging the affairs of the people of Washington. They don't need lectures about voting rights. They need voting rights. They're the only population of tax-paying, draftable American citizens in the country who don't have equal voting rights in Congress. And when January 6th came and people stormed this chamber and waged violence against the Capitol Police, against the Metropolitan Police Department, against hundreds of people who live in Washington, as well as in Maryland and Virginia, the people of Washington stood with democracy. They stood with Congress. And they have a legitimate grievance, not a phony counterfeit grievance They're not claiming to have won an election they didn't win. All they're asking for is equal rights. Let's grant them their statehood. And if you can't stomach the idea that they would be a state, at least allow them their home rule rights to decide for themselves who's going to vote in Washington, D.C., and what their criminal laws are going to be, and what their laws of abortion are going to be, and what their civil rights and civil liberties practices are going to be in the District of Columbia. I will reserve, and I'm happy to turn it over.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of Chairman Comer's resolution disapproving of the D.C. Council's recent action to allow non-citizens, including illegal immigrants, to vote in local elections. The Council's actions undermine voter confidence and faith in our elections, and ultimately the sovereignty of the United States. Voting is a sacred right reserved only for American citizens. That's why federal law and the Constitution prohibit non-citizens from voting in federal elections. In order to further promote integrity in our elections, many states have also prohibited non-citizens from voting in their state and local elections. Our nation's capital should be a model for the rest of the country. But for years, the district has run poor elections, and now the council wants to take it even further by allowing non-citizens to vote. At a time when communities across our nation are dealing with the consequences of an unprecedented number of criminals, human smugglers, and deadly fentanyl pouring across our borders, it is unthinkable that the D.C. Council wants to reward those who have broken the law. Further, this would let diplomats vote in D.C. elections, some of whom can be agents of our adversaries, like China and Russia. That's why several of my colleagues on the House Administration and Oversight Committee last Congress, including Chairman Steil and Mr. Comer, sent a letter to D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser criticizing the measure and calling on her to reject it. Congress can and should exercise its constitutional responsibility over D.C. and stop this law with this joint resolution of disapproval. I'd like to commend Chairman Comer for leading this common sense measure and taking steps to restore voter confidence. We've seen that in states like Georgia and Florida, when you implement key election integrity tools that make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, we can boost voter confidence, which in turn boosts voter turnout. So we need more election integrity, not less.
Expired.
I yield 30 seconds, Mr. Speaker.
So we need more election integrity, not less. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make a couple corrections. First of all, the D.C. legislation that would be disapproved by this resolution allows only for voting in local elections, school board elections, advisory neighborhood commission elections, council elections. It does not allow voting in federal elections for non-citizens. And the Constitution, contrary to what the gentlelady said, permits non-citizen voting at the local level, and there are a number of jurisdictions that do that. With that, I'm going to yield 5 minutes to the very distinguished representative of the people of the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
I thank my good friend for yielding, and I strongly oppose this undemocratic, paternalistic resolution. There is only one question before this House. The question is, do you believe in democracy? More specifically, should the District of Columbia's local legislature, whose members are elected by D.C. residents, make laws for D.C.? Or should Congress, whose voting members are elected by the residents of the several states, make the laws for D.C.? What is democracy? The dictionary defines it as a, quote, government in which the supreme power is invested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections, end quote. Perhaps President Lincoln described democracy best in the Gettysburg Address. government of the people, by the people, for the people. DC's local legislature, DC Council, has 13 members. The members are elected by DC residents. 8 members are elected by geographical area. 5 members are elected at large. If DC residents do not like how members vote, they can vote them out of office. Congress has 535 voting members. The members are elected by residents of the several states. None are elected by DC residents. If DC residents do not like how the members vote, even on legislation that applies only to DC, they can only ask politely for residents of the several states to vote them out of office. The Revolutionary War was fought to give consent to the governed and to end taxation without representation. Yet the nearly 700,000 DC residents cannot consent to any action taken by Congress, whether on national or DC matters, and pay full federal taxes. Indeed, DC residents pay more federal taxes per capita than any state in the Union, and more total federal taxes than 23 states. The legislative history and merits of this legislation enacted by the DC Council, that is the subject matter of this resolution, are irrelevant to the question before the House, but I do want to set the record straight. The DC Council passed the legislation on 2 separate occasions, as required by Congress, by votes of 12-1 and 12-0 after holding a hearing. The legislation is also unprecedented. It is not unprecedented. Indeed, there's a long history in the United States of non-citizens being allowed to vote in local, state, territorial, and federal elections. I will close with 2 final thoughts. DC residents, a majority of whom are black and brown, are worthy and capable of governing themselves. It is true Congress has absolute power over DC, but might does not make right. If you believe in democracy, you will vote no on this resolution. I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
You know, there's talk about how people are accountable to different levels of government, but how are you accountable when there's no protection articulated in this legislation for the voters on keeping 2 sets of voter lists? You know, DC residents are entitled to vote for the presidency and for federal offices. And you're going to have, I need to ask the question out loud. Are members of Congress okay with members of the CCP that work at the Chinese embassy voting in U.S. elections? Are you comfortable with employees and members of Putin's regime that work at the Russian Federation embassy for voting in D.C. elections? These are questions that this body must ask itself when considering this legislation. And make no mistake, 2 sets of books aren't going to work in any board of elections in America. You're entitled to vote in this election, but not that. There's going to be commingling, and the volunteers that work the polls are not going to, have all of the tools necessary to stop people from intermingling in those elections. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of Chairman Comer's resolution. As if free flights, free phones, free health care, free education, free lawyers, and other freebies being offered to illegal aliens weren't already enough, the D.C. City Council decided to now give illegal aliens the right to vote, a right that more than 1.1 million American military service members have given their lives for. Giving this right to illegal aliens as if our government is the Oprah Winfrey Show. You get a vote, you get a vote, you get a vote. It makes a mockery of the constitutional republic, of our brave heroes who fought and died for to defend. The right to vote is the most sacred right in our constitutional republic. Giving the right to vote to non-citizens cheapens this sacred right by discounting the value of citizens' votes. It also cheapens the value of American citizenship and cheapens our standing around the world as we incentivize the invasion of our own country. Under Biden's watch, over 4.6 million illegal aliens, and those are just the ones that we know of, have already crossed our wide-open southern border that Secretary Mayorkas and Joe Biden refuse to secure, that Democrats could have done something about for the past 2 years when they held all levers of power and refused to do so. Well, by the end of the year, Biden will have let in more illegal aliens than the entire population of my state of Colorado. Instead of trying to secure the border, Democrats are more focused on giving illegal aliens more handouts and privileges, including giving them the right, the sacred right, to vote. These illegal aliens are even treated oftentimes better than our veterans, who are struggling to have their health needs met, to have health care, to get the services that we promise them for their great service. But it is immediately given to those who come across our southern border illegally. Let's put American citizens first, not cheapen their votes. Let's pass this legislation and ensure the voice of the American people is heard without interference from foreign nationals. I urge support of the underlying bill, and Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was just reviewing some materials that showed that both the states that the gentlelady from Colorado and the gentleman from New York represent had non-citizen voting in the 18th, 19th, and in the case of Colorado, up to the 20th century. So I think, if they're talking about giving away the sacred right to vote, their states have done that before, and it's got a kind of interesting history to it. I mean, to me, it's basically irrelevant because it's not our decision to be making. It's up to the people of D.C., just like it's up to the voters in Colorado and it's up to the voters in New York. But the history of it is intriguing because when the country started, as I'm sure the gentlelady is aware, there were race qualifications for voting, there were gender qualifications for voting, and it was only through social struggle that those were removed. But at the beginning of the Republic, all that mattered was the property qualification, the wealth and property qualification for white men. And if you were a white man, regardless of your citizenship status, you had the right to vote. And that lasted basically up into the Civil War. But it became a bone of contention between the North and the South because the northern states were continuing to defend alien suffrage, and the southern states opposed it. In fact, if you look at Article 1 of the Confederate Constitution, the very first thing it does, it says you must be a citizen of the Confederacy in order to vote there. They didn't want non-citizens voting. Why? Because the immigrants were overwhelmingly anti-slavery. And it was very clear in the debates in Congress about this that the southern states wanted to get rid of it, which is why the Confederacy banned it. After the Civil War, non-citizen voting spread around the country. But the point is, when we're talking about local non-citizen voting, who's going to vote in your school board or town council elections, that should be decided locally. And my colleagues who are the ones determined not to make the District of Columbia a state should be the first ones to say, if it's just a local government, let them decide who's going to vote on matters of garbage collection and who their teacher is going to be. The jurisdictions that have done this, like Los Angeles, have wanted to make sure that parents in local public schools get the right to vote, regardless of their citizenship status. Most of the non-citizens, of course, are lawful residents, people with green cards, permanent residents, and they want them to be engaged and involved. In any event, if my friends really support home rule and local self-determination, they will allow the people of Washington, D.C. to decide that. And with that, I'm going to yield 4 minutes to my friend from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the ranking member and my colleague from Maryland. It is rich, so rich to hear the other side discuss the sacred right of voting, discuss what our veterans and our service members fought for in the sacred right of voting, while defending and continuing to defend the disenfranchisement of American citizens in D.C. for their right to vote. They don't believe in statehood. They don't believe in the actual enfranchisement and voting rights for D.C. residents who are U.S. citizens, and yet they have the audacity and the gall to not just continue in that position and claim they believe in the sacred right to vote while denying that right to vote for an overwhelmingly black city, but then expanding their position so that in direct contradiction of their quote-unquote conservative values of small government and defending freedom have decided to expand the jurisdiction of this body to meddle into the business of D.C. residents. The D.C. City Council has the right to determine its policies for D.C. residents. And if any member of this body does not like that, they can feel free to change their registration, resign their post, and run for D.C. City Council. And for those who are residents here of Washington, D.C., they could have, as the ranking member stated, gone to any one of the many hearings on this issue. I understand that there may be disagreement. I understand that Republicans may not be happy with what the D.C. City Council is doing. But when cities in Vermont passed the same provisions, when San Francisco, when 9 Maryland cities brought up this provision, did the Republican Party corral all of Congress and bring this issue down to the floor for a vote? No, they did not. They are singling out the residents of the District of Columbia and expanding in the history of disenfranchisement that goes all the way back to the legacy of slavery. And they're bringing it right here to this floor because why? They don't have any real bills to debate. We're not here to talk about health care. We're not here to talk about abortion. We're not here to talk about voting rights. We're here to talk about the expansion and the continued subjugation and disenfranchisement of the people of the District of Columbia. Let them govern themselves. And with that, I yield back to the ranking member.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of Chairman Comer's resolution. The radical D.C. City Council is literally putting the integrity of our election system at risk. They've passed a bill to allow illegal immigrants, Chinese, Russian agents, foreign exchange students, and quite literally anyone else who finds themselves on the streets of D.C. in our nation's capital for longer than 30 days, the ability to vote in elections. This should not be a partisan issue, and you don't have to be a Republican to understand why this is wrong. Voting is a sacred right. Regardless of what was just said, voting is a sacred right. This ridiculous measure disenfranchises millions of legal American citizens and opens up our election system to a host of security issues. In fact, the mayor of D.C. didn't even sign this. Congress must pass this resolution today, but we should also move to pass my bill, H.R. 192, to make it clear to D.C. That they cannot ever allow non-citizens to influence our nation's capital. We're putting every single member, both Republican and Democrat, on the record about whether they support non-citizens voting. Of course, I urge my colleagues in the House and the Senate and President Biden to pass our bill, to pass this measure, to sign it into law immediately. And let me just say one thing in response to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, who a few moments ago said, quote, "We brought back our worst possible instincts," I think when referencing the Republican Party. This tells you everything you need to know. It tells you everything you need to know about Americans. Please listen up. This tells you everything you need to know, that the radicals want you to think that this is normal, and it's not. Americans deserve confidence in our election system and confidence in knowing that only legal American citizens are casting their vote in elections here in this country. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do we have?
It has 14 and a half minutes.
Good. Well, I'm going to take a couple just to respond to the gentleman before he goes, perhaps. When I said that they were returning to their worst possible instincts, That was actually a bipartisan comment, because in the old days it was Democrats, racist Dixiecrats on the House District Committee who lorded over the District of Columbia and denied the people of Washington their rights. So they're returning us to those days where Congress will micromanage the affairs of Washington, D.C. and not allow the people their own self-government. He said you don't need to be a Republican or a Democrat to understand the issue. It would actually help to know your Abraham Lincoln, because, of course, Lincoln was a major defender of non-citizen voting, to the extent you guys want to act like a super D.C. council and get into the merits of it. In fact, when he was elected, his opponents, his Southern opponents, said he was elected on the strength of the non-citizen vote in New York, as a matter of fact, and in Illinois and other states where they had so-called declarant alien suffrage, which means if you are on the pathway to citizenship, you're allowed to vote, which is a policy that makes a lot of sense, but different jurisdictions have different policies according to home rule and self-government. When Lincoln was here, his major legislative initiative, interestingly enough, was to abolish the slave traffic in the District of Columbia, because he felt that freedom and democracy should obtain in the nation's capital. That's something that our colleagues should also think about in terms of defining an agenda of their party, and I know they're careening from this issue to that issue. But if you're thinking about D.C., think about what Abraham Lincoln did. And with that, I'm delighted to yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is yielded 2 minutes.
Pleased to thank the ranking member for his leadership, and of course Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton for her continued consistency in refuting and rebutting wrong-headed and misdirected policies that seem to come year after year. Let me read breaking news from one of the historic newspapers in this month that we begin to focus on Black history. From the Washington Informer, the headline says, D.C. Council blasts House GOP interference in city law. D.C. Council members have lashed out at Republicans on Capitol Hill for seeking to meddle in city affairs. For some reason, Ranking Member Rashkin, there was some thought that our friends were riding in on a white horse because there was some disagreement on the council. That disagreement, as you have so effectively said, and with the Congresswoman as well, is that they want to handle their own matters. But let the record be clear that the United States Constitution does not forbid non-citizens from casting a vote in local and state elections and other elections. At least 15 cities currently allow non-citizens to cast ballots in local elections. And particularly, non-citizens were occasionally permitted to cast ballots in local, state, and federal elections in 40 states from the time of the nation's inception until 1926. So we have had a history of local decisions being made by local voters. In this instance, local voters voted and made a decision. Whatever modifications they desire to make, they're not asking this place to implode their work. As we begin to think about voting rights, I would ask my colleagues to help join us in supporting the John Lewis Voting Enhancement Act that we've tried to pass here, Democrats, in this Congress for a long, long time. I'd ask them to help us in the redistricting that skewed and denied Democrats in Texas 2 districts that were legitimately based upon the census that was in fact created by Hispanics and African Americans.
Gentlewoman's time's expired.
I'd like to yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
Gentlelady is yielded 1 minute.
But in redistricting across the nation, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, were states in which voting rights were directly undermined. Some of the restrictive legislation that was passed in Georgia and Texas are evidence of the oppression of many in the Friends who are across the aisle parties in states to deny people of color their right to vote. And so it looks as if we have an opportunity here for champions of voting rights that seem to be evidenced across the aisle. Join me in the John Robert Lewis Voter Enhancement Act. But at this time, in this month, we ask that you allow the citizens of Washington, D.C., one, at some point to have statehood, but more importantly in this instance, to stay out of home rule decisions or to stay out of decisions granted to them. Those decisions are granted to them. For that reason, I am enthusiastically in opposition to H.J. Res. 24 because this legislation goes beyond the boundaries of the responsibilities, duties, and rights of this body. Leave the government of Washington, D.C. to the people of Washington, D.C. I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
You have 18 minutes.
18 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to speak in response to some of the opposition that I've heard to this legislation. First of all, we've heard about slave trade multiple times this evening. And if we're concerned about slave trade, well, then let's secure the southern border, because that's where the human trafficking has taken place. And millions of people are being trafficked, and women and children are being sexually assaulted and abused. Young girls are taking Plan B pills at the start of their journey because they anticipate being sexually assaulted on their journey. So if this is something that you are that concerned about, then let's work together to secure the southern border and stop the human trafficking and the slave trade that is happening there. There's slavery that's taking place in China in the cobalt mines that these climate extremists are pushing. There's child and slave labor there, and that's where we're extracting our rare earth minerals from China-owned mines in the Congo. So let's talk together about American energy. You know, you say that this is just for local elections. Are there 2 registries? Well, how is that going to work if there are 2 registries? But I don't think it's going to stop there because every time we give in and give an inch, well, they take 7 miles. And the gentleman on the other side of the aisle, he mentioned that in Colorado, illegal aliens are voting. Well, illegal aliens are voting, but no state has actually allowed that since 1926 in America. There are loopholes that are allowing illegals to vote in our election, and this is election interference, allowing non-citizens to vote in our elections. And in fact, this is why crime rate is up in Colorado. We are encouraging illegal aliens to come to Colorado. We are #1 in the nation for bank robberies, #1 in the nation for auto thefts, #2 in the nation for fentanyl poisoning. We have a Department of New Americans. And if you go to the Colorado State website, it says, well, what is a new American? A new American is a Coloradan. May I have another minute?
I yield 1 minute.
Gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you. What is a new American? A new American is a Coloradan, an immigrant seeking asylum, a refugee, asylee, a DACA recipient, an SIV holder, and all other forms of immigrants seeking safety, opportunity, reunification of family, chain migration being encouraged in my state where non-citizens are voting and making a difference in our elections. Now, if there's a better way to do so, then let's let the D.C. County reevaluate this. That's why we're sending it back to them. And I would say that statehood is a matter that Congress has to consider on behalf of the entire nation and pursue a constitutional amendment if so desired. Congress dealt with this issue in both the 116th and 117th Congress and rejected the idea. Congress has jurisdiction over D.C., and we need to ensure a vibrant capital city. This act does the opposite. And so I would, again, encourage opposition to this bill. I yield back.
Reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The distinguished gentlelady from Colorado boasts that her state is #1 in auto thefts, #1 in bank robberies, and #1 in fentanyl, as I understand it. It sounds like they've got their hands full with their own problems, and I don't know that they should be spending their time dictating to the people of Washington, D.C. what their voting rights policy is going to be. Now, both the gentlelady from Colorado and the gentleman from New York invite the question of, would it actually be administratively possible for a jurisdiction to have 2 separate voting lists for those who are eligible to vote just in local elections and those who are eligible to vote in both local and federal elections? Well, that's a great question that you could have posed at a hearing within the Oversight Committee if we'd had one, but we didn't have it. But I actually happen to have researched this question, and there are a number of jurisdictions around the country which permit non-citizen voting at the local level, and they have 1 list for that. And if you're a non-citizen, when you enter, your name is checked off that list, and you get 1 ballot, which is just for your school board elections and the local elections. And then if you're citizen, you get a complete ballot that includes local, state, and federal elections. So there actually is an answer, and it's working in multiple jurisdictions around the country, including several in my home state of Maryland. And I think the same thing used to be able to work in New York State as well. So that's something that would be easily researchable, and it's something also that we could have answered if we had followed regular order and actually had so much as one hearing on this subject before deciding to jump in like King Kong and squash the people of Washington, D.C. And with that, I want to recognize again the distinguished non-voting delegate from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Gentlewoman from District of Columbia is recognized.
I thank my friend for recognizing me because I have something important to say and to put into the record. 40 states have permitted non-citizens to vote at various points. One of them is the state of the gentlewoman who has just spoken, Colorado. The other states are Alabama, Arkansas, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, Virginia, Washington State, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. At least 14 municipalities permit non-citizens to vote today. 11 in Maryland, Barnesville, Chevy Chase, Section 3, Garrett Park, Glen Echo, Hyattsville, Martin's Additions, Mount Rainier, Riverdale Park, Somerset, and Tacoma Park. 2 in Vermont, Montpelier and Winooki, 1 in California. San Francisco allows voting for non-citizens who are a parent or legal guardian of a child living in San Francisco to vote in local school board elections. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ms. Norton. And I should just say that none of those jurisdictions have been overrun with fentanyl or illegal aliens. All of those are jurisdictions which are functioning democratic self-governmental units, just as the jurisdictions in New York and Colorado that have the same practice were. This really isn't about non-citizen voting, Mr. Speaker. This is about democratic self-government and allowing local jurisdictions to make home rule decisions for themselves, because this isn't the end of it, this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, I think we're going to be considering a resolution of disapproval for the District of Columbia's criminal justice reform that they've engaged in over the last 9 or 10 years, involving judges, federal, local judges, council members, the D.C. bar, and so on. We don't know anything about that. We didn't have a hearing, and yet someone is going to pick something out. What the good chairman of our committee talked about in the Rules Committee was a carjacking law where I guess the minimal sentence changed. Well, we looked up Kentucky. Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking law. You'd have to use armed robbery, which can only get you 20 years. The District of Columbia would treat carjacking with up to a 24-year sentence. So these are the kinds of measurements we're going to have to go through with everybody's state and everybody's jurisdiction if we're really going to turn ourselves into the super D.C. City Council and try to get to know the people of Washington and what their concerns are and what they're into. The whole reason we went to Home Rule in 1973 was so that Congress could spend its time on national policy issues, the kind that President Biden was talking about last night. We just added 12 million new jobs to the American economy. We passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure plan to invest in the ports and the airports and the bridges and the roads and the highways all across America. Not just in the District of Columbia, no insult intended, but that's a very tiny part of the jurisdiction of Congress, and they want to turn us basically into an appellate legislative division over the District of Columbia. We're going to be prepared to close, and I will reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I also have no further speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. This legislation, which promises to be the first of many, we know that I think tomorrow criminal justice reform comes up. I know that the MAGA wing of the Republican Party doesn't like Medicaid-funded abortions in Washington, D.C. They don't like the stricter gun safety laws that the people of Washington, D.C. Have passed. They don't like their progressive legislation protective of the LGBTQ community and so on. And so we're headed now for a mini culture war between the dominant MAGA wing of the Republican conference today and the people of the District of Columbia, who find themselves in an odd situation because they want to be admitted to the Union the way 37 states have been admitted to the Union after the original 13 were. And that means, by the way, that 3/4 of the states, nearly 75% of the states, came in after the original 13. They appealed to Congress to use our powers under Article 4 of the Constitution to admit new states. They have exercised their powers under the First Amendment and under the Ninth Amendment and under the 10th Amendment to organize a new statehood constitution and to petition for admission to the Union. Now, we haven't our muscle memory is weak here because it hasn't happened since Hawaii and Alaska. But my friends, Thomas Jefferson thought that this was the destiny of communities under the United States of America. We would not be a colonial power that would continue to lord over people perpetually. On the contrary, when he talked about the Northwest Ordinance, he said, as sufficient population formed and as commitment to democratic principles were realized, these new communities would be admitted as states. And I think as a matter of basic civic respect and self-respect, we owe the people of Washington our attention when they are asking for admission to the Union. These are people who pay more per capita in federal taxes than anybody in the country, more in hard dollars, I believe, than the people of 18 or 20 states. They've served in every war that America's ever fought. They're subject to the military draft. It's just that when Eleanor Holmes Norton, the distinguished professor of constitutional law from Georgetown University, comes to this floor, she comes as a non-voting delegate. And there's no representation and no voice over in the Senate. Well, that's an offense to basic democratic principles that we teach children in second grade. So we should be passing statehood again in the 118th Congress, the way we passed it in the 117th, the way we passed it in the 116th, and we should get the Senate to focus on it. But short of that, the very last thing we should be doing is rolling back the rights, the limited rights that the people of Washington have to exercise home rule powers. I oppose this resolution, and I'm happy to yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The D.C. Council has once again put its radical agenda ahead of the American people. This time, the district's progressive D.C. Council is directly disenfranchising American citizens. In this day and age, it's often the case that the only factor differentiating the privileges of American citizens from non-citizens is the right to vote. And the D.C. Council wants to erase that distinction. The United States Congress must exercise its constitutional oversight role over the District of Columbia, the seat of our nation's capital, and reject this offensive local legislation. In a time when our democratic institutions must be protected more than ever, it is imperative that the United States House of Representatives, the People's House, unite in opposition to the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act. We must reject the D.C. Council's misguided efforts. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the sacred rights of the American citizenry by voting for Representative James Comer of Kentucky's resolution of disapproval. I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 97, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the engrossment and third reading of the joint resolution. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution disapproving the action of the District of Columbia Council and approving the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022.
The question now is on the passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is
Mr.
passed.
Speaker, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
For what purpose do you rise?
To ask for the nays and the ayes, to request a recorded vote.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.